the world. And I remember actually vividly to this day, every now and then I begin to feel a bit sorry for myself, and I think, well, life is quite difficult for a little kid in a foreign country, more or less by himself. And then I only had to look at this picture of a little kid already ruler of 6 million people, and things were put into perspective. I was free from self-pity. So the picture sat on my desk, and then we moved to California, and it accompanied us over here. And it sat on my desk for many, many years in California. And then, in the kind of event that all of you in Long Beach know about, a forest fire struck up about half a mile from our house and razed the house to the ground and reduced really everything, including the photograph, to ash. And in some ways, I think, very usefully, brought home exactly the real meaning of the photograph, which is the Buddhist truth of impermanence, that you can't cling to photographs, you can't hold on to the stuff of the world. But if the value or the possibilities that the photograph stands for, if they become part of your being, then that can withstand fire or flood or earthquake or tsunami. Well, the next part of this process was that when I was 17, my parents decided to take me back to India, my ancestral home, to meet the grandparents and uncles and aunts and cousins I'd really never had a chance to meet before. And my father decided that part of this program would involve meeting the Dalai Lama. And these days, I have to admit, with embarrassment, as I look back on myself, I was a typical 17-year-old. I wanted to meet either Jerry Garcia or Keith Richards. But a professional philosopher and a colleague of my father didn't exactly send me, running in excitement towards the entrance. But of course, I was 17, so I didn't have a choice. And I remember we went to Delhi Station, as travelers still do, on their way to Dharamsala. We took the overnight train. We got off in this little town called Pathankot. We got into a taxi for the winding 4-hour trip, zigzagging around curves up to the foothills of the Himalayas. Dharamsala in 1974 was really just a scatter of huts along a hillside. And we drove along the mountain road to really the last house, a yellow, modest cottage, rang the doorbell, and went in to see the Dalai Lama. Nobody was knocking on his door. Nobody really knew who or what he was in the 1970s. And Dharamsala, some of you are from India, I can see, you probably know Dharamsala is famous for having the rainiest, most monsoon-stricken climate in the whole of India. But that day, although it was an August day, there was no rain, but there was a very heavy fog. And I remember as we sat in the Dalai Lama's room, which has huge picture windows looking out on the valley below, all I could see was this thick, impenetrable mist. No houses, no figures, no signs of human habitation or life as I thought of it. And it really seemed to me, in my teenage innocence, that these two philosophers were sitting on top of a mountain, talking about compassion and reality and emptiness and other high philosophical concepts. I didn't know that the Dalai Lama had already actually been dealing with the Chinese leadership for 25 years at that point. And of course, as a good 17-year-old, I tried not to listen to them. And I probably couldn't have understood much of what they were talking about, but clearly something stuck. And it meant that as soon as the Dalai Lama made his first trip to this country, 5 years later, in 1979, I went to hear him just near the pizza joints where Fred and I used to talk about George Eliot and not talk about George Eliot. And in the early 80s, as you remember, he began to come to this country with more frequency. And I would go to press conferences of his in New York, and there'd usually just be 4 people, 3 Tibetans and me. It was amazing how people almost thought of him as a figure out of legend more than real life, as recently as, say, 1985. And the final step in this process was, as soon as Tibet opened up to the world in the 1980s, I went along to Lhasa, Tibet. And any of you who's been to Tibet knows that it's almost impossible not to be moved. Just by the intensity of the elements, the sharp cobalt skies, the shafts of sunlight coming into the dusty chapels, the monks in the corners muttering their prayers. It's impossible not to be moved just by the warmth and the hospitality of the people, especially then. They'd never really seen foreigners in all their history, and they were so happy to see us, who were their eyes and ears. And also not to be moved by the fierce loyalty with which they were sustaining their tradition and their culture as well as they could in the midst of 25 years of very difficult circumstances. The final thing I'll say, before I leave the somewhat boring subject to myself and turn to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, is that, as you heard from Fred and Bipasha, all the time that I was going to Dharamsala and traveling and talking with the Dalai Lama, I was also, as I still am, a practicing journalist, and I've been writing for Time magazine for 27 years. So most of my life is spent in North Korea and Beirut and war-shadowed Sri Lanka and Yemen and Ethiopia and El Salvador, places of great difficulty and suffering. And so, like anyone, going back and forth between these war zones and this man who spoke so rigorously for peace, I always tried to think what this unusually clear-sighted political thinker could bring to these countries that seem to be locked in an intractable cycle of violence. Because one thing that surprised me, I have to meet a lot of politicians in my job, and one thing that surprised me was the single most realistic politician I'd ever met was in fact the Dalai Lama. I think most politicians I met were always talking about that never land in the head that's called the future, or the past, which really can't be changed. And the Dalai Lama was the only one who almost seemed like a scientist with his microscope to be looking at the present moment to see exactly what it was and then to see what could be done with it. Some of you who've heard him or who may hear him when he comes here next week or later know that one of the things he always says is, dream nothing. Don't hope or wait or pray for some miraculous resolution to your situation or predicament. Just see what you can do right now in your immediate environment to make the lives of the people around you better, and in so doing, to make your own life better. I thought, very practical and clarifying, tonic vision to the world that didn't partake really of abstraction or ideology at all. And I should say at this point, I'm not a Buddhist, and I don't speak Tibetan. I do spend a lot of time in a monastery, but I'm not a monk. But one thing that really hit me is that part of the unusual aspect of this Dalai Lama's life is that he spends so much of his life in rooms like this, in places like CSULB, talking to large audiences who probably have no knowledge of Buddhism and really no interest in Buddhism. And I think of him really almost as a doctor of the mind. So just as any doctor, there are probably some in this room, sits on a vast body of very technical, specialized knowledge that most of us wouldn't understand, but tries to compress that into very simple, everyday precepts that everyone can follow. I think that's exactly what the Dalai Lama is doing. When he travels around the world, he's really making it a global house call to some extent. And as you know, what he'll often say is, well, this is something I found useful. If you find it useful, that's great. If not, throw it out and turn to another doctor. But in some ways, he allows us, I suppose, not really to see him as a Buddhist, but just as somebody who's offering universal human principles that may or may not be effective for anybody he meets. And I noticed that as I talked to him, there were various things that began filtering into my mind. For example, the notion that you change the world by changing the way that you look at it. That suffering is not the same as unhappiness. For Buddhists, of course, suffering is almost the fabric of our life. Every birth ends in death, every meeting ends in a separation. Sickness and old age are part of every life. But for Buddhists too, that doesn't mean that unhappiness is inevitable. Unhappiness is just a position you choose, or if you want, cannot choose to bring to those circumstances. The Dalai Lama has suffered as much as anyone, and I think he's famous for anything, if anything, for his smile and his optimism. When I heard him speak also, I thought about this global community of which we're a part, and the way in which he suggests that China and Tibet, and for that matter, France and Canada and US, all their identities are really intertwined, so that if you hit the Chinese, you're really hitting the Tibetans. And if you help the Tibetans, you're helping the Chinese. But that we're all in a neighborhood, and we're all part of the same family, almost the same body. So for a Tibetan to hit a Chinese person is like the right arm hitting the left. It doesn't make sense. You're only harming yourself. And so I thought that, let's say when I go back to my home in Santa Barbara tomorrow, if I find that my neighbor, in my absence, has thrown a rock through my window, as I pick up a rock in order to throw it back, if I just stop for a second and I think, well, the minute I fling this rock, of course I'm going to damage my neighbor's life, that's my intention. I'm probably going to enrage every other neighbor, and most of all, I'm going to make my own life a misery for the next several years. I'm just going to set into motion an unending series of lawsuits and reprisals and recriminations, and if I really want to have a happy life, put the stone down. It's not going to help me, let alone help anybody else. I think as I listened to him, heard him say that, for example, all the peace treaties in the world are not going to be any use if the people who sign them are still jealous or territorial or guarded inside themselves. If I sign